Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, viewers. I'm Matthias Ofiku, news editor of the Namibia Sun newspaper. Welcome to another edition of the Evening Review Show. Before we get into the business of the night, let's have a look at tomorrow's headlines. One of the stories that will feature tomorrow is no test for fully vaxxed tourists that will be coming into Namibia. The initiation debate rages on at one of the SWACOP schools, as well as a story on the Dubai Expo and the impact of the travel ban of the UAE on the operations. Well, we're joined in the studio tonight by Mr. Salomo Hei. He's the board chairperson of the Namibia Statistics Agency. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Compliments of the new year.
Thank you for the well wishes and compliments to you and to your viewers.
Thank you very much, sir. 2022. Well, you called it the year of the census in your New Year's message. Can you give us a brief summary on why that topic specifically?
Well, Matthias, 2022 is a year where we need to take account of our people. We need to embark on a very serious process, which means we need to count the number of people that we have in Namibia. You would have appreciation for the fact that this exercise takes place every 10 years. We are no different to any other country, especially our neighbor South Africa also carries it out in that fashion. It's the year of the census because we really need to start planning around statistics. We need to make sure that we can account for every person in this country. If you look at, for instance, last year we were unable to carry out the exercise precisely because of one, COVID, and then obviously also budget constraint as it relates to priority areas. This year this is the biggest big ticket item on the Namibian calendar because it sort of take care of everyone in the context that we will be going across the whole country to make sure that we can give account of all households in this country. And so I don't think there's anything bigger than census taking place in 2022.
Yeah.
And that is really the background why we have called this year the year of the census.
Okay. So in terms of modalities so far, how far are we in terms of preparing and getting ready for this big exercise?
Well, if you remember correctly, the census, the population census survey is an exercise that takes place over a certain period of time. And remember that there's planning that needs to take place and some of the work has already commenced. You would remember that, for instance, last year we carried out the mapping exercise. Now, the mapping exercise is the pre-enumeration activity. And part of that process is really to sort of look at enumeration areas where we break down the country in different segments in order to be able to sort of plan around where the counting will take place and where the enumerators will be in. And as part of that process also we did a pilot census, and the pilot census obviously looked at the methodology that will be applied, the soundness of the questionnaires that will be used, and so we have sort of already started with that process, and remember that some of the planning started 5 years ago because precisely to culminate in the actual exercise which will take place this year now. So last year we carried out the mapping, pilot census, identifying enumeration areas. And so we all systems go. The NSA is ready to really put its best foot forward and to make sure that we comply with best practices as it relates to methodology and how population census and surveys are carried out.
Yeah. You make it sound as if it's such a mammoth exercise, but maybe also just for the benefit of the viewers, when compared to the national elections that we have, where the ECN also is to run around the entire country and so on. How different is it? Just not in terms of size, but in terms of executing the mandate.
Absolutely. This is quite a massive exercise in our view. If you look at over the 2-month period that we'll be carrying out the exercise, we will be employing close to 12,000 Namibians. These 12,000 Namibians will be trained in terms of soft skills as it relates to the enumeration activity. So you would have a huge number of vehicles crisscrossing the country. There's a safety component to that effect. So you need to make sure that that exercise is carried out in a manner that the insurance, the safety, and. So it's massive. It's an exercise, and precisely because the planning starts over a 5-year period, and this is where we find ourselves now. So in relation to the elections, obviously it's 2 different activities, but also very similar because in a sense that the voting take place quite in different polling stations. With the census specifically, we have to go to the most remote of areas. We have to go to the most deepest of villages that you can find in this country because we need to make sure that we account for everyone. And in terms of size, I think that the number of people that vote, is quite in relation to the number of people that we need to count. Again, is to make sure the one is quite massive in that aspect. And so I don't know whether we can compare the 2 in that manner, but obviously there are similarities. And from our end is that the census itself and the importance thereof cannot be sort of understated. Remember that insurance policies needs to understand the number of people in the country for them to be able to do projection on policies. Pension funds, again, they need to understand what is the age demographics, at what level what is the current retirement population, the number of people that are currently moving towards or in retirement or in 5 years will be in retirement, or what is that number. If you look at, for instance, and I'll use the example where I come from, Okonjatu, for instance, in Okonjatu there's a school, that only goes until, the school that's there goes only until grade 9, right? And it has been like that for the past how many years, right? So what is the point I'm making? The point is population could have grown. There could be now a need for a school that goes until grade 12. You speak health facilities, right? Even in the most remote of areas, is there a need for these health facilities to be upgraded because the population demands that? The economy itself, in terms of understanding what is the profile of young people in this country, what is the growth rate of those young people in relation to the previous census, and then we use it over the year, So it's quite an exercise that will really assist the country in planning. It will assist even you as a newspaper or as a news agency to be able to understand your readership in terms of the current circulation, because it gives you the true reflection of the number of people that we have in the country. So it's an exercise that is quite far-reaching, and everyone from public to private sector will be impacted and will be able to draw or rather derive benefits from this exercise.
Of course, the last census was 2011. We do know that if you are not serving on the NSA board, you are an economist by training. And there's been concerns that perhaps the time frame in between is too long from a developmental perspective. Well, what would you say to that?
Well, not only that, but also because of how the world is changing rapidly in terms of how fluid the environment is that we find ourselves in. Maybe as part of the radical data revolution, we need to consider transforming the way we carry out census. And the only country that's having the conversation currently. All other advanced economies are also looking at saying, isn't there a better way of sort of carrying out the exercise as opposed to the slag that you are talking about, but also the magnitude in terms of the current capital outlay and expenditure around it, to say that, look, perhaps we could use more technical advancements that can assist us in making sure that we account for people much quicker as opposed to the 10-year cycle. So it's not a question that's necessarily out of line with the times. And as the NSA, we assist with a discussion to sort of look at what is the best practice, what can we do much more quicker, much more faster, and be agile in carrying out some of these surveys. I mean, if you remember correctly that, for instance, South Africa now today releases its labor force every quarter. Previously it used to do it on a 2-year cycle, and then a year, and then obviously now it's a quarterly. So there's always an advancement in terms of how the service can be carried out. And the population and census survey is no different. As part of modernizing and making sure that we move with the times, there is definitely consideration to move this on a more frequent and a more sort of agile and in line with the times. So it's definitely a conversation, it's definitely an alternative, and like all things, there's always room for improvement. And it's not only Namibia or the NSA that sees with this conversation, it's all across the globe. And really to also look at perhaps administrative data as a way to maybe bring efficiency as part of this process in terms of the timelines that you are making reference to. So where the NSA finds itself, the NSA is ready to transform, is ready to modernize in line with the global demands.
But as an economist, what would you say are some of the economic planning impediments that the current model that we use? What are some of those impediments, perhaps?
Well, look, you ideally want to deal with real-time data, real-time statistics. And the delay or the lag in statistics from a release perspective does obviously compromise the response, right? For instance, again, the NSA is looking at saying what is the reference period and when we actually release the data in terms of the GDP figures, for instance. Isn't there a better way, or rather a faster way, to release this data as opposed to releasing it 90 days after the reference period? So the point is, what is the current international best practice? What is the benchmarks, right? Obviously, there are other countries who are able to release estimates much quicker, and we should maybe consider doing that as well. And as part of that process, then it sort of gives be it economists, be it researchers, be it planners, a better response time in terms of understanding the implications of a certain GDP figure, a certain decline in a sector that they are involved in, tourism or whatever it may be. But there's also quite other success stories. For instance, if you consider how we release the CPI, you know, again, there we are well in line with the best practices in the world. How quickly we release CPI, and if you look at some of the other indexes that the NSA has built over the years, which are quite useful for the market and for the economy, I don't know how often it's used though. But from a planning perspective, you don't want to have the delay in the release of the data too far out, because it does compromise the response. You know, things are changing very quickly, and with that you want the same sort of response and the same sort of release around key economic indicators.
Okay. Just before we go for the ad break, I'd like to leave you with these questions. If resources permits, what would you say is the ideal time frame that we should have between these cycles? We'll touch on that when we come back from this short ad break. Well, welcome back from that short ad break. Well, we were saying, should resources permit, be it financial or human resources, and if it were entirely up to you, how often do you think census should take place?
Well, you, the size and the magnitude of the exercise is massive, right? I think we all agree on that score. If you have the administrative data, say from Home Affairs, for instance, which gives you the population in terms of birth certificates and the death rates as well, it's also recorded, and so you could look at how you can coordinate and sort of come through with a figure through the process, which could really assist in terms of getting a picture of what does the Namibian demographic look like at that point. But also because the census itself is such a highly technical exercise that they have to carry certain methodologies. Remember that we spoke about the pre-enumeration activities that took place last year, which includes mapping and pilot census, precisely to test the credibility of the methodology questionnaires and so if it was up to me, and remember that we give strategic direction, at the same time I want to make sure that I don't fall foul of anything but whatever, but really the point is that if you look at, for instance, during the pandemic, the number of people that we have lost and the recording, those records are available, and not only for us but all across the world. So if we can shorten that period to maybe eventually to 5 years, right? And then with time, as we perfect and as we advance and as technology allows us, we move towards an annual sort of population estimate. I think we would be doing very well because it's important to be able to speak to real-time data, precisely because of the importance of the data, not only to government but also to the private sector in terms of how the insurance companies use this, how the pension funds, how businesses sort of project and do case studies around numbers. So from where I am, I think that there's a constant improvement to really shortening the time in terms of how the census should be carried out. It won't be Namibia that decides that by itself. Obviously, the methodology is a benchmark globally, and we would be guided by that process as well.
Okay. So in terms of synergy, from a synergy perspective, how connected is the system? You mentioned earlier on if systems such as Home Affairs could be utilized in this process, maybe just to already do some groundwork before the initial process starts.
Well, the Act empowers the NSA as the functional leader of the statistical system in the country. Also, the Act also empowers the NSA to coordinate the national statistical system in the country. Now, if the question is, have we carried out what the Act empowers us to do, it's definitely one of the work that we assist with. As part of the new message that you spoke to, remember that we also indicated in that message that the NSA is in the process of coming up with a new strategic plan, and the strategic plan will have precisely the coordination component in terms of making sure that the system is connected. We want to make sure that we know exactly what is the number of cattle we have in this country through, again, the Ministry of Agriculture, and use that process to be able to sort of account for that economic sector. We want to make sure in terms of how can we coordinate the Home Affairs online system, and really understanding that I had a conversation the other day where someone was telling me that for you to apply for a passport, you have to go to the police to go certify your birth certificate, but you get the birth certificate from Home Affairs. You see, so what is the point? The point is that if one is able to circumvent some of this, and everything is on the system, and you are able to have a one-stop shop, if it were, for some of these things. So you come to apply for a passport, and all your details can come up there, and subsequently this statistical records or statistical database can then be coordinated by the NSA. There was an interesting report a week or 2 weeks ago from the Statistics South Africa, where they were saying that the average age of married couple is 36, right? Again, it's a statistics that we can also do with, and they can come from this coordination component that we are referring to. So it's all part of this new strategic plan. I think it's really an exciting time in the life of the NSA, because we are moving with the times, and we are definitely part of the statistic revolution that is being observed globally, and we are getting onto that show.
Yeah. Of course, you mentioned earlier on about the mapping exercise that took place already. And what were some of the indicators that you got, perhaps, as to what you should look at as you prepare for the big occasion later this year?
Well, it's really just to, obviously, we need to strengthen training in terms of the enumerators. Obviously, there's also what you find is it becomes the validity and the authenticity of who the enumerators are, because remember that in instances like this, you also find some sort of people taking chances, them being enumerators to access people's private property, and one needs to be careful how you sort of circumvent that. Again, in terms of the efficiency around the turnaround times, once field work has been done, we also need to make sure that we are able to have the turnaround time much quicker, to be able to make sure that the exercise is seamless, and if there's any challenges in the field in relation to that, the response should be very quickly, that we don't have any delays, because we want to make sure that we lead on this front, and I think, I mean, those are the real sort of issues that one need to consider when you want to make sure that you are on clockwork as it relates to the work that you're undertaking.
Okay. And just from a safety perspective, we know, of course, like polling stations, there are always police officers present and so on. You spoke about ensuring that that risk is eliminated as far as enumerators going to residents and so on. What measures have you and your team suggested so far?
Yes, absolutely. There's an ongoing conversation with the law enforcement on this aspect, and as we get closer to the time, the information will be made public in terms of perhaps the cards or whatever that the enumerators would have, and the originality thereof, so it cannot be simulated, and the law enforcement is ready to assist in that regard as well. So it's a collective effort. I mean, the 12,000 or 11,500 enumerators, give or take, that we would be using for this exercise would generate employment for the 2-year period. That will obviously translate in some sort of economic activity, which would mean that you would have demand coming back again. The vehicles that will be used, again, it will mean that that's local procurement directly into the hands of Namibians. So there's quite opportunities and available for the Namibian populace at large in this exercise. So we're looking at making sure that as part of that process, it's not only the law enforcement, but everyone else that needs to have hands on deck.
Yeah. Okay, the other aspect I would like us to touch on perhaps is when we speak development and when we speak planning, of course we need to speak numbers. And you guys, NSA work closely with the National Planning commission. So this time frame, this 10-year cycle, in terms of development plans of the country and so on, how do you think this impacts the entire process?
Well, look, you don't necessarily do away with development plans because you are waiting for a census. The census give you a base on which you launch, design, devise development plans.
Yes.
So as part of that process, the development plans are not compromised, especially from a census perspective, right? There is the challenge in the lag because of perhaps you wanting to verify real-time data immediately.
Yeah.
But also what we do know is that within that 10-year cycle, there's a 5-year where we have that intercensational survey as well,
yeah.
where we sort of give an idea of what the population demographics look like. There are other indicators, obviously, that the NSA also releases that are in line with development plans, and that can also look at whether how we are performing in relation, for instance, to the Sustainable Development Goals and our targets and how far we are from them.
Yeah.
But in a nutshell, the NDP, the different national development plans are essentially the base on those plans come from the census. Yeah. And so you don't necessarily deviating from it, but you're building out of them. If the question is, have there been other surveys that perhaps we should have carried out in the time period that could have assisted in us tracking progress in relation to the output or in relation to what we had or what we have as national objectives? Absolutely. And one of those is obviously the labor force survey. Obviously we want to have it a bit more frequently, and we want to make sure that we are able to understand the state of the employment status of the country, because you don't want to have institutions that are not necessarily the functional leaders of statistics in the country telling us, for instance, what is the poverty levels. And if you remember correctly, a year or two ago, we released the multidimensional poverty report. And again, that is the statistical authority in terms of where we are as a country as it relates to the poverty dynamics. So there are indicators that we have released quite aggressively. There are those that have sort of fallen off the table precisely because of funding priorities. If the question is, are they coming back? Absolutely, they are. The National Household Income and Expenditure Survey, it's another important one. And because that one obviously fits into the GDP, the national accounts, and the CPI. So the labor force survey, because we are coming on the back of COVID, which has been devastating in terms of employment, the number of people that are no longer employed. So you want to have sort of the real analysis on the ground in relation to how COVID has really impacted the Namibian economy, and that can come through some of those surveys. And I think there's a collective effort to obviously make sure that this is realized, and we are working very hard to make sure it happens.
Okay. Mr. Hei, thank you very much for your time, and we wish you and the team all the best as you prepare for this mammoth task.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to your viewers. Thank you.
Choose your flex package with Paratus today. Sign up for ultra-fast fiber with the convenience of mobile LTE. That's 2 products in one bundle. It's new, it's one bill, and you can stay connected in more than one location.
For more information, visit paratus.africa/NA.